The radio in my ambulance was still playing John Philip Sousa when the first body hit the windshield. I want to be precise about that, because precision is the only thing that has kept me sane since. It was 6:42 in the evening, the 4th of July, and the heat hadn't broken, even with the sun sliding down behind the Lincoln Memorial. 91 degrees, 90% humidity, the kind of Washington evening where the air sits on you like a wet wool blanket, and the marble of the monuments holds the day's heat long after dark. I was parked on Constitution Avenue between 7th and 9th, bay doors facing the National Mall, doing exactly what I'd done for 19 straight Independence Days as a district paramedic. Waiting. That's the job on the 4th. You wait. You wait for heat strokes, because people stand for 6 hours in direct sun without drinking water. You wait for the drunk who climbs onto a friend's shoulders and comes down wrong on the concrete. You wait for the old veteran whose heart finally gives out under a sky full of light, surrounded by the flag he bled for. Which is honestly not the worst way to go. And I've told more than one widow exactly that. You wait, and people break in predictable ways, and you fix what you can. And at the end of the night, you drive home with your ears ringing from the fireworks, and you sleep until noon. The man who hit my windshield was named Darrell Foss. I know that because I'd treated him 40 minutes earlier, right there at the back of my rig, for textbook heat exhaustion, clammy skin, rapid pulse, that gray pallor under the sunburn. I'd given him water and an electrolyte packet, and made him sit in the shade of the open bay doors for 10 minutes, while his little girl, maybe 6 years old in a red, white, and blue dress, asked me if I'd ever fixed a real broken bone. I told her I'd fixed hundreds. She'd looked at me like I was a wizard. Then Darrell had thanked me, hoisted her up onto his shoulders, and walked back toward the reflecting pool to find his wife. Now his face was pressed flat against my windshield, and his eyes were the color of spoiled milk. 2 opaque marbles, with no person behind them. And he was biting the glass, not screaming, not pounding, biting. Methodically, his jaw working, his teeth scraping and clicking against the laminate. Like the glass was something he genuinely believed he could chew his way through if he was just patient enough. His daughter was nowhere. That detail is the one that still wakes me up at 3 in the morning, with my heart going like a trip hammer. Before I tell you what came through the crowd behind him, I want to say something to you directly. Thank you to everyone who keeps coming back to these stories. And if this is your first time here, welcome, pull up a chair and stay a while. If grounded survival stories like this are your kind of thing, subscribe and leave a comment, because it genuinely helps this channel keep going. Now let me get back to what happened on the mall, because the worst part wasn't Darrell Foss. The worst part was what was behind him. 300,000 people were packed onto the National Mall that evening, shoulder to shoulder from the Capitol steps all the way west to the Lincoln Memorial. Sitting on blankets and folding chairs in the bare grass, eating funnel cake and waving little plastic flags, waiting for the fireworks barge out on the Potomac to light up the sky. And the screaming hadn't started yet. That's what I need you to understand. People were still clapping. A high school marching band somewhere up near the Washington Monument was still grinding through a patriotic medley, brass and snare drums carrying across the grass. And a wave of movement was rolling through that enormous crowd from west to east. A ripple like wind moving through a field of wheat, except wheat doesn't fall down and then get back up wrong. My name is Walt Reyes. I was 51 years old that day. I'd buried a wife to cancer 4 years before, raised a son who'd moved to Denver and didn't call enough, and I'd seen more death in 3 decades on an ambulance than most soldiers see in a career. I'd held people's intestines in with my hands, I'd done CPR on a toddler in the back of a moving rig for 11 minutes, knowing the whole time it wouldn't take. I am not a man who shocks easily. And I'm telling you, with all of that behind me, I had no frame for what I was looking at. None. The part of my brain that's supposed to categorize a scene and assign it a protocol just sat there, idling, refusing to engage, because there was no protocol for this. I keyed my radio. My hand was steady. I noticed that distantly, the way you notice things when the rest of you has gone quiet. Dispatch, Medic 41. I've got a mass casualty event on the mall. Possible active assault, multiple down. Requesting all available units and MPD. Over. The dispatcher's voice came back, and the steadiness was already gone out of it, which scared me more than anything I'd seen. Tina worked that desk. I'd known her 12 years. She did not rattle. 41. We're getting repeat multiple of the same, everywhere. The whole... Stand by, 41. Stand by. Stand by. There's no standing by when a grown man you treated for dehydration an hour ago is trying to eat his way through your windshield. I climbed back into the box, into the patient compartment, partly to grab my trauma bag, and partly, let's be honest, to put a 1/4 inch of steel between me and that biting face. The compartment smelled the way it always did, of antiseptic wipes and the faint copper undertone you can never fully scrub out of a vehicle that hauls bleeding people. The overhead LEDs were on. My gear was racked and squared away the way I keep it, because a sloppy rig kills people. Cabinet of saline, drug box, locked, oxygen. The defibrillator in its bracket with the green ready light blinking. Everything in its place, everything useless against what was outside. Through the small rear windows, I could see Constitution Avenue. And Constitution Avenue was wrong in a way that took me a second to name. A federal city on the 4th of July is a machine. I'd watched them build it every year, the Park Service and the Capitol Police and the Secret Service and a dozen other agencies. Miles of bike rack barricades chained together, white jersey barriers the size of coffins, magnetometers and bag checks, mounted park police, snipers you weren't supposed to notice on the rooftops. All of it engineered to move and control 300,000 bodies, to funnel them into orderly channels, to keep a vehicle from plowing into a crowd, and to keep the crowd from surging. It is one of the most heavily managed pieces of ground on the planet for one night a year. And, in about 4 seconds, sitting in the back of my rig, I understood that all of it had just become a trap. Every barricade built to keep the crowd orderly was now a wall that kept them from running. Every choke point was a kill funnel. The fences that protected the parade route had become the bars of a cage, and the things inside the cage were turning one after another in a wave. And the people who weren't turning yet had nowhere to go. I watched a park police officer, I'd learn her name later, Sergeant Iris Van, backed up against a Jersey barrier near the 9th Street crossing, drawing her sidearm, screaming at a teenage girl in a Nationals jersey to get back, get on the ground. The girl kept coming, stiff-legged, head cocked, that milk-white stare. Van fired. I saw the muzzle flash, 2 of them, and I saw the girl's chest jump with the impact. Center mass, 2 rounds, exactly the way they're trained, exactly the way it works on every range and in every classroom in America. The girl absorbed it like a strong gust of wind. A half step back, a stagger, and then she kept walking. And Van's face in the streetlight did something I'd only seen on the faces of people watching a loved one flatline the total collapse of a thing they had believed was solid ground. Center mass doesn't work. I'm telling you that now, early, the way I wish someone had told me. It cost an enormous number of people their lives in those first hours. Good people with training and weapons who did everything right and died doing it. Because the one thing they knew for certain about stopping a threat was the one thing that was wrong. Remember it. It nearly cost me my life more than once. And the only reason it didn't is that I figured it out by watching. And I watched because watching is the job. Darryl Foss had stopped biting the windshield. He turned his head slow, mechanical, like a security camera panning toward a sound off to my right. A family had taken cover behind an abandoned hot dog cart about 20 feet from my rig, and a baby was crying. That was the loudest, sharpest, most insistent sound on Constitution Avenue. And I watched every gray-eyed body within 100 feet rotate toward it, the way a field of sunflowers turns toward the sun. They tracked sound. I didn't have the concept yet, didn't have words for it, but I saw it happen. And some animal part of me filed it away before my conscious mind caught up. The family was a man, a woman, and an infant strapped into one of those fabric chest carriers. The man had put himself in front, arms spread wide, doing the thing fathers do that feels like courage and accomplishes exactly nothing against a threat that doesn't fear you. The woman had the baby's face pressed against her chest, trying to muffle it. And the baby was having absolutely none of it. The way babies are when they're hot and frightened and the world has gone insane around them. And from 3 different directions, Foss, a heavy-set woman in a yellow sundress, and a man in a Park Service polo shirt with a name tag still clipped to it, the dead were converging on that sound. I had a choice in that moment. And I want you to understand, it was a real choice, not a movie choice where the hero never really doubts. I could stay in the rig. The rig was steel. The rig was, without exaggeration, the single safest place on that street. And it had wheels and a half tank of diesel. And the moment a lane opened, I could be gone. Every line of my training, every protocol drilled into me about scene safety. Secure the scene. Do not become a second patient. You cannot help anyone. If you are dead, every bit of it said, stay in the vehicle. Instead, I leaned forward into the cab, found the air horn relay under the dash with my thumb, and I pressed it and held it. The blast was enormous. A genuine truck horn, the kind that's supposed to be heard over highway noise. And in the relative quiet of that strange suspended moment, it rolled across Constitution Avenue and slapped off the limestone face of the National Gallery and came back. Every gray-eyed head on that street snapped toward me at once. Foss, the woman in the sundress, the Park Service man. And in the seconds that followed, dozens more I hadn't even registered, dragging themselves up from between the barricades, out from behind strollers and coolers and overturned chairs, turning toward Medic 41 like iron filings toward a magnet. The family ran. I saw the father grab his wife's arm and haul her east toward 6th Street, the baby's face finally lifting away from her chest, and the 3 of them vanished into the churning dark of the crowd. I never learned if they made it. I've decided to believe they did. I bought them maybe 15 seconds with that horn, 15 seconds and a clear direction. And sometimes 15 seconds is everything. What I bought myself was the complete and undivided attention of the dead. They came at the ambulance from the front and both sides. And the first one, Foss again. Always Foss hit the driver's door hard enough to rock the whole 5-ton vehicle on its suspension. I lunged into the cab and slammed the door locks down, all 4, my thumb mashing the button. And through the windshield, Foss was already back. Those milk-white eyes inches from mine, his broken and bloody fingernails dragging down the glass, with a sound like nails on a chalkboard, scaled up to nightmare size. The horn had been a mistake. I understood that with total clarity, even as I made it. Sound was currency, and I had just spent my entire balance on a single family. I'd made myself the loudest thing on the street. But here's what 30 years on an ambulance teaches you. If it teaches you anything, panic is a luxury. You don't get to feel it. You file it away in a box and you deal with the patient. And the patient is never stable. And the moment is never clean. And you act anyway. So I did the only thing left to do. I turned the key. The big diesel under the hood coughed once, caught, settled into its heavy idle. I put Medic 41 in drive, and I started to push through them. Not over them. Through them. There is a difference, and the difference matters when you're crawling forward at 4 miles an hour, with a body folding under your front bumper, and you feel the whole rig climb and then drop as a tire rolls over something that used to be a person. I have run codes on children. I have told mothers in hospital hallways that their sons were gone and held them up when their knees went. None of it prepared me for the sound a human body makes under the wheels of a 5-ton ambulance. And I am not going to describe that sound, because some things aren't for retelling, and you don't need it in your head the way it's in mine. I made it 2 blocks. That was all. Constitution Avenue west of 7th was a parking lot of abandoned vehicles, doors hanging open, engines still running. A park police cruiser slewed sideways across 2 lanes with its light bar still strobing red and blue across the dead. And the dead were everywhere. And the dead were getting up. That was the detail that finally killed the last of my denial. The part of me still insisting this was some kind of mass poisoning, a gas attack, a thing with a medical explanation. The teenage girl in the Nationals jersey. The one Sergeant Van had shot center mass. I saw her again, 3 blocks from where she'd gone down, on her feet, walking. People who'd been bitten and fallen were standing back up, and the turn was fast. Minutes. Not the slow, creeping fever of the movies, not days of mounting symptoms. You got bitten. You ran a few hundred yards on pure adrenaline. You went pale and gray. Your eyes clouded. You dropped, and within a few minutes, you came back up wrong, and you started hunting sound. I needed to get off the street. That was the only clear thought I had. I needed a structure with controllable access walls, a door I could shut, ideally one way in. And here is the cruel joke of Washington, D.C. It is, hands down, the most fortified city in America. It is riddled with bunkers and blast doors and continuity of government facilities, hardened sites built to survive a nuclear exchange. All of it designed so the government keeps functioning while the rest of us don't. And every single one of those places was sealed, key-carded, guarded, and utterly inaccessible to a paramedic in a city ambulance. But I knew one building that wasn't. I knew one place that, on a normal 4th of July, would have its loading bay standing open and a skeleton crew of 2 inside, watching the same parade everyone else was watching. The Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History sits right on Constitution Avenue between 9th and 12th. And it has a sub-basement loading dock with a roll-up steel door tall enough to swallow a moving truck and a concrete ramp graded gently enough that an ambulance can climb it. I'd been inside that bay a dozen times over the years, hauling out the occasional collapsed tourist or a staffer who'd had a cardiac event among the dinosaur bones. And the security supervisor there was a man I knew. Eugene Tarr, 63 years old, retired Capitol Police, who'd taken the museum gig because his federal pension didn't quite cover his wife's diabetes medications. I'd shared bad coffee with Eugene more than once in that loading bay at 2 in the morning, waiting on a patient transfer, talking about nothing. If Eugene was working tonight, and if that door was open, I had somewhere to go. I cut the wheel hard and turned south on 12th, which was clearer, the buildings squeezing the crowd panic down to a trickle. And I drove the wrong way down a one-way service road, with my heart slamming against my ribs and my knuckles white on the wheel. I came around onto the Constitution Avenue side of the museum, and the roll-up door was open. It was open. There was a white Smithsonian box truck half pulled into the bay, and standing in the gap, waving a heavy black flashlight in big sweeping arcs, was Eugene Tarr, screaming something I couldn't hear over the diesel. I will never forget the look on his face when he recognized the ambulance through the windshield. It was the first uncomplicated hope I'd seen in 20 minutes, and it nearly undid me. I gunned the engine and took the grade. The rig's undercarriage shrieked against the lip of the dock. I felt it scrape, felt the whole frame jolt, and then I was inside, swallowed into the cool gray dark of the loading bay, and Eugene was already hauling on the heavy chain that ran the door. The steel came rattling down behind me in a controlled roar and hit the concrete sill with a boom that I felt in my sternum, in my back teeth, in the floor of the rig. And for the first time since 6:42, there was a real wall between me and the street. Then I heard the bodies hit the other side of it. A dozen at first, soft, heavy thuds against the steel. Then more and more, until the whole door was drumming with it, a low, irregular thunder of dead weight throwing itself against the metal. The roll-up flexed inward and shuddered and held, the chain rattling in its track, and Eugene Tarr stood there in the orange wash of my hazard lights, with his face gone the color of cold ash, and said, Walt, what in God's name is happening out there?" I didn't have an answer. I shut down the diesel, and the bay dropped into a quiet broken only by the booming of the door and the tick of the cooling engine. I had a half-tank of fuel, 4 liters of saline, 2 oxygen tanks, a trauma bag, a working defibrillator, and a radio that was still, somehow, faintly, playing the last bars of a John Philip Sousa march off some automated station that hadn't yet figured out the world had ended. The loading bay was bigger than I remembered, maybe 60 feet deep. The ceiling lost in shadow above a string of caged work lights and the low orange pulse of the ambulance's hazards, which I'd left running on purpose for the light. The air down there was different from the street cooler by 10 degrees, still, and it carried the smell of concrete dust and old diesel and a deep mineral coldness that I couldn't place at first. Eugene told me later the building sits on fill and clay above the buried bed of an old creek, the Tiber, that the city paved over a century and a half ago, and that the lower levels stay cool year-round because of it. That detail seemed like nothing at the time. It would matter later, in ways I couldn't have guessed. The way most things in that building turned out to matter later. Eugene wasn't alone in the bay. There was a second person, a young woman in a museum staff polo, crouched against the far concrete wall with her knees pulled up tight to her chest and her back jammed into the corner where 2 walls met. She'd made herself as small as a person can make herself. Her name was Priya, 26 years old, a graduate researcher who'd been working late up in the entomology department cataloging a beetle collection, actually pinning specimens, she'd tell me, on the 4th of July, because the work didn't stop for holidays, and the grant deadlines didn't care. She'd come down to the loading dock when the building alarm started shrilling. There was a laceration on her left forearm, a clean, shallow cut maybe 3 inches long, and the first thing I did, before anything else, before I even fully caught my breath, was cross the bay and crouch in front of her and check it. Because that's the job. And because doing the job was the only thing I knew that would keep my hands from shaking. "It's not a bite," she said. Fast, the words tumbling, reading my face before I'd said a word. "It's not a bite, I swear to God. I cut it on the door, the freight door, the edge of it. It's glass and metal, it's not, please. It's not a bite." "I believe you," I said. And I kept my voice flat and easy. The voice you use on a patient who's about to panic. The voice that says, I have seen worse than this 1,000 times, which I had. Hold still. Let me look. The wound was exactly what she said. It was a clean, linear laceration. The kind metal gives you, not the ragged, tearing crush of a human bite. I'd already seen enough bites that night through the windshield to know the difference. I cleaned it with what I had and wrapped it in gauze and tape. And the whole time I watched her eyes, because by then I'd learned that the turn started in the eyes. That clouding, that milk coming up behind the iris. Her eyes stayed brown and frightened and human. Good. I let out a breath I hadn't known I was holding. Eugene, meanwhile, had locked himself into a kind of frozen, methodical competence, the way old cops do when the ground falls away. The panic was in him. I could see it in the gray of his face, in the slight tremor of the flashlight in his fist, but it was underneath a thick crust of procedure, and the procedure was holding. He'd already gone through the building's emergency layout in his head, was already counting doors. "We've got the freight door, that one," he said, jerking his chin at the booming steel. "And the personnel door off the bay there. That's it for ground access on this level. The public entrances are up top, the big ones on the mall side and the Constitution side. Those are 40-foot glass curtain walls, beautiful and worthless. Those won't hold back a stiff breeze, let alone that." He swallowed. "There's a security office on the first floor, monitors. If the cameras still have power, we can see the whole building from there. Every hall." Power. That was the first real survival question, the one that would govern everything else. And Eugene answered it before I could ask. The museum ran on city power, but it had a diesel backup generator down in the sub-basement, 2 levels below us, because the collections couldn't survive a temperature swing. He explained it like a man who'd been briefed on it, and 100 times, and never thought he'd need it. The specimens, the preserved tissue, the type specimens that entire branches of science are anchored to. The irreplaceable physical originals, against which every later identification is measured. They live and die by climate control. So the generator existed to keep the air handlers and the chillers running no matter what. And it held enough fuel for about 72 hours of critical systems. 72 hours. 3 days of lights, cameras, the freight elevator, and the water pumps that kept the lower levels from flooding up out of that old buried creek bed. I filed it away and held onto it like a handrail. 3 days was a number I could work with. 3 days implied that somebody, somewhere, was coming. The National Guard, FEMA, somebody. You don't lose the capital of the United States in 72 hours. That's what I told myself. We went up to the security office, the 3 of us. Priya kept in the middle, moving through service corridors that Eugene navigated in the dark by memory and the bobbing cone of his flashlight. The building above us was enormous and silent, and that silence was its own kind of horror after the chaos of the street. The Museum of Natural History is one of the largest museums on Earth, 125,000 square feet of public exhibition space alone. Halls the size of cathedrals. And behind them, an entire hidden museum of labs and collection vaults and offices that the public never sees. On a normal day, 8,000 visitors move through it. On the evening of the 4th, it had closed at 5:30, so the public halls should have been empty. They weren't quite empty. The monitors in the security office told us that. The office was a windowless room, maybe 12 feet square. The far wall covered in a grid of screens, most of them showing grainy green-tinged night vision views of the building's halls and stairwells and storage rooms. Eugene dropped into the chair in front of them like a man coming home, his hands finding the controls without looking. And as the views cycled, we saw that there were people in the building. The cameras caught them on the upper floors. a janitorial crew that had been cleaning the dinosaur hall when everything went wrong. A couple of staff researchers, like Priya, who'd stayed late. And a family we'd pieced this together later that had been on the mall when the screaming started and had somehow fought their way to a maintenance door on the Constitution side and slipped inside, looking for exactly what I'd been looking for. 11 people total, scattered across 4 floors, most of them with no idea the others existed. And there were 3 of the others. Already inside the building. We watched on the central monitor as one of them moved through the great rotunda, the soaring octagonal space under the famous African bush elephant, the one that greets you when you walk in off the mall. The figure wore a torn security uniform. Eugene leaned in close to the screen, and his breath caught, and he whispered, "That's Marcus. That's Marcus from the day shift. He was supposed to be off at 5. The thing that had been Marcus drifted across the rotunda floor in that patient, mechanical way, head slightly cocked, until some sound off-camera turned it, and it lurched out of frame toward the human noise with that awful purpose. Eugene put his hand flat on the desk to steady himself, and I saw it shake against the metal. "Marcus has a master key card," he said, very quietly, like saying it louder might make it more true. "Day shift supervisor. It opens every door in this building, every secure lab, every collection vault, every door we'd want to lock behind us." That was the first turn of the whole night, and it wasn't the outbreak. The outbreak was just weather, a thing that happened. The turn was the realization that the dead inside the building weren't a random horror to be avoided. They were a logistics problem with intent. And one of them was carrying a key to everything. The building I'd run to for safety was not a fortress. It was a 100,000 square foot maze full of strangers who didn't know they were being hunted, with a dead man walking through it, holding the master key to every door, and only one solution I could think of to any of it. We had to reach those 11 people before Marcus and the other 2 did. And we had to do it without making noise, in a building I was beginning to understand was about to become the most dangerous scene I'd ever worked. I want to tell you about the 11, because they stopped being numbers very fast, the way patients always do. We mapped them off the monitors first. Eugene knew the camera grid cold 20 years of staring at screens like these, first at the Capitol and then here, and he called out positions the way a man reads off a familiar street, naming halls and stairwells before I could even orient on what I was looking at. The janitorial crew, 3 of them, were on the 2nd floor in the mammal hall, and crucially, they had a radio. One of those cheap consumer 2-way sets the cleaning company issued. That meant they had a way to make noise dangerous, but also a way to be reached and coordinated, which was worth more than anything. A pair of researchers were locked inside a lab on the 3rd floor, in the back-of-house section the public never sees. A warren of fluorescent-lit rooms full of microscopes and specimen drawers. The hidden family, a man, a woman, and 2 kids were tucked into a 1st-floor coat-check alcove right off the mall entrance, which was the single worst location in the building, because it was barely 40 feet from those 40-foot glass curtain walls that wouldn't hold. And then there was the 11th person, and I almost missed him, because unlike everyone else on those monitors, he wasn't moving and he wasn't frightened. A man, sitting on the polished floor of the gem and mineral hall on the 2nd floor, his back against the case that holds the Hope Diamond, perfectly still. Eugene squinted at the screen and frowned. "That's not staff," he said slowly. "I don't recognize him. And nobody just sits down, not tonight. We'd find out who he was. He would matter more than any of the rest of us. And I'd give a great deal to have understood that sooner." Here was the operational reality I laid out for Eugene and Priya in that cramped, screen-lit room. The three of us crowded around the monitors while 11 lives glowed green in front of us. We were 3 people. One was a 26-year-old researcher with a bandaged arm and no relevant training, though Priya would prove me wrong about her worth inside the hour. One was a 63-year-old retired cop with a bad knee. I'd watched him favor it on the stairs, and I was starting to notice a worse cough, a wet, rattling thing he kept trying to swallow. And me. We had no firearms. Eugene's museum post was unarmed, a deliberate Smithsonian policy, and my ambulance carried nothing but medicine. We had a building we could partly see and partly control, a freight elevator, and 3 dead things wandering the floors, one of them carrying a master key. Marcus was the immediate problem. As long as that thing had the master key card, no locked door in the entire building was reliable. We watched it drift back into frame in the rotunda, and Eugene started explaining how the card system worked, talking fast because explaining was keeping him steady. Every door logged every swipe to a central system. There was a terminal right there in the office that displayed the access log in real time. And this was the part that made my stomach lift from that same terminal. An administrator could remotely revoke any card. Eugene could, from where he sat, kill Marcus's master key with a few keystrokes. So he did. He pulled up the log, his fingers moving over the keyboard, found the card number tied to Marcus's credential, and revoked it. We watched the confirmation appear on the screen. And for one stupid, hopeful second, I let myself believe we'd just solved something. Then the lights flickered, the work lights in the corridor outside. The LED on the camera grid and every monitor in the room dissolved into static for 3 full seconds. When they came back, the system had rebooted into a stripped-down safe mode and locked Eugene completely out of the administrative functions. The remote revocation had tripped some kind of tamper protocol, a security feature designed to stop exactly the thing an attacker might try, somebody mass revoking cards to lock people in or out. To get back in, the system wanted a supervisor credential. And that credential, Eugene told me with a sinking flatness in his voice, was kept in a safe in the museum director's office, on the 4th floor, past everything between us and the top of the building. So that was the shape of it. The one clean fix, kill the key, secure the doors, had locked itself away on the top floor of a building full of the dead. I made the call to start with the janitorial crew. Because they had a radio, they could be reached. And 3 working adults who could be brought down and turned into allies were worth more to me than I could say. Priya knew the frequency the cleaning crews used, Channel 3. She'd heard them chattering on it through 100 late nights of pinning beetles. There was a spare handset charging in a cradle on the office wall. Eugene took it down, thumbed it to Channel 3, and keyed it. And he spoke low and slow and steady. The voice of a man who'd spent a career talking frightened people back from the edge of something. He said it was Eugene from security, that there were rescuers in the building, that we could see them, that they were going to be okay. And after a long and terrible silence, full of dead air and the faint hiss of the open channel, a voice came back. A woman. A whisper, ragged with fear. She asked if we were the police. Her name was Doreen. She had 2 co-workers with her, a man named Hector and a kid named Sam, who was barely 19, and I could hear it in the background, crying as quietly as he could manage. They'd barricaded themselves into a janitorial supply closet off the mammal hall. A little room with a mop sink and a floor drain and shelves of cleaning chemicals and not one other useful thing. And there was something outside the closet door. They could hear it, a soft, patient bumping against the metal. On, off, on. I took the radio from Eugene. The plastic was warm from his grip. "Doreen, my name is Walt. I'm a paramedic. I'm going to get you and Hector and Sam out of there. But I need you to do exactly what I say and nothing else. And I need you to trust me even when it's hard. Can you do that?" A whispered yes. "Good. Now listen carefully. The thing outside your door, is it making any sound of its own? Talking, moaning, growling, anything at all?" "No," she breathed. "It doesn't. It just bumps. Against the door. Like it forgot how doors work. Like it knows we're in here, but it can't figure out the door." That tracked with everything I'd seen on the street. They weren't smart. They tracked sound, they moved toward it, and a closed door they couldn't see through. Clearly confused them, the sound source was right there, and then it wasn't. And the geometry of a barrier seemed to short something out in whatever was left of their minds. The thing outside Doreen's closet had probably heard them earlier, fixed on the spot, and was now just standing there in the dark of the mammal hall, swaying, waiting for the next sound to point it somewhere new. "Then here's exactly what you do," I said, keeping my voice the same flat and certain thing it had been on 1,000 bad scenes. "You go completely silent, all three of you. No whispering, no shifting your feet, no crying, 'Sam, I know that's hard, son, and you're doing fine. But I need you quiet as a held breath. You don't touch the door. You don't touch anything that rattles. You just wait. That thing out there is going to lose your scent, so to speak. Some other sound somewhere in this building is going to catch it, and it's going to drift off after it. And when it's been dead silent outside that door for 5 full minutes, 5 minutes by a clock if you've got one, you key this radio one time. One click, no words, just so I know. Can you do all that?" She could. The radio went dead, and the three of us in the security office sat in the cool green glow of the monitors and watched the camera that covered the mammal hall, where single dark shapes stood swaying outside a closet door. And we waited. And not one of us breathed normally. This is the part where I have to tell you about the 11th person, because while we were managing Doreen, the man against the Hope Diamond case stood up. On the monitor, he rose smoothly. No stagger, no lurch. He uncoiled off the floor in one clean motion, and that alone told me everything I needed to know about whether he was living or dead. He was lean, dark-clothed, maybe 40, with the kind of economical movement that you usually only see in people who've been trained to move that way. And he moved through the gem hall with a deliberateness that was nothing like the dead, and nothing like the panicked, scrambling civilians either. He moved like a man who already knew the building, like a man who knew exactly where the cameras were mounted. Then he stopped, turned, and looked up directly into the lens, directly at us, and held up a piece of paper with words on it in thick black marker. It said, "Turn off the cameras. They see the status lights." Eugene and I looked at each other. It was nonsense on its face. The dead tracked sound, not light. I'd watched it happen with my own eyes on the street, watched 100 heads snap toward an air horn while a dozen flashlights swept right over them and did nothing. Camera status lights, those tiny red LEDs, drawing the dead. It made no sense. But the man was insistent, jabbing his finger at the sign, then pointing up at the camera, then back at the sign, his whole posture sharp with urgency. And there was something in his absolute certainty that crawled under my skin in a way I couldn't name. The way a person's confidence can make you doubt the thing you watched happen with your own 2 eyes. If you've ever been in a room where one calm, certain stranger makes everybody else start second-guessing what they know, then you understand exactly the moment I'm describing. I want you to remember the man at the Hope Diamond. And I'd genuinely like to know, down in the comments, would you have trusted him? The calm one with the plan? Or would you have trusted what you'd watched happen out on the street? Because I made a choice about that man, and it was the wrong one, and it took me far too long to see it. We didn't turn off the cameras. That much at least I got right, and it was mostly Eugene's doing. He wouldn't surrender his eyes on the building for anything, and I backed him. And after a long moment, the man at the Hope Diamond lowered the sign, gave the camera one last unreadable look, and drifted off toward the north stairwell and out of frame. I told myself he was just scared. Just another survivor with a half-baked theory, the way frightened people get. I told myself a lot of comfortable things in that office that I would pay for later. Doreen's single click came through right on schedule. A sharp burst of static against the silence that made all three of us flinch. On the monitor, the shape outside her closet had drifted off, gone, hunting some other sound deeper in the building, exactly as I'd promised. I keyed the handset and started talking them out. A few feet at a time. Second floor Mammal Hall, then the East Service Corridor, the back-of-house passage, narrow and concrete and free of the big open sight lines that let the dead see a long way. Then the freight elevator. The freight elevator turned out to be the spine of the whole operation, the thing that made any of it possible. It was a big industrial steel box that ran from the sub-basement all the way to the fourth floor, used for moving exhibits and crates and the occasional whale skeleton. And Eugene could call it and control it remotely from the security terminal. That became our lifeline, the engine of the whole night. The principle was simple, even if the execution was anything but. Move people through the service corridors that the public never sees and the dead didn't seem to favor. Get them to the freight elevator. Bring them down to the loading bay where the ambulance sat and the steel door held. A protected vertical artery through a building full of death. It worked for the cleaners. God, it worked. It took 20 minutes that aged me a decade. 20 minutes of murmuring three terrified people through a pitch-dark museum in increments of a few feet. Doreen, stop. There's one in the next hall. Do not move. I can see it. Wait, okay. It's drifting east. Go now. Go. Quietly. Left at the dinosaur. The metal door. That's it. 20 minutes of watching them on the grainy monitors and watching the dead drift through other halls just a wall away. But they made it. They reached the freight elevator. The doors rolled shut on Doreen's tear-streaked face. The box descended through the building. And then I heard it arrive in the loading bay below us with a clang. And a minute later, Eugene's radio crackled, and a man's voice, Hector, said, broken with relief, "We're down. We're in the truck bay. Oh God, we're down." That was the high point of the whole night. I should have known. In this work, the exact moment you let yourself feel competent is the moment the floor opens up underneath you. The researchers came next, the pair locked in the third floor lab. And they came easy because they were smart and disciplined. And they did precisely what I told them. A man named Dr. Owusu and a woman named Carla, both in their mid-30s, both still wearing blue nitrile gloves from whatever they'd been doing when the world ended. They moved through the corridors like people who could think under pressure, freezing when I said freeze, moving when I said move. And inside 15 minutes, they were down in the loading bay too. And it was Dr. Owusu. Once he'd caught his breath and climbed up into the back of my rig to sit, who gave me the second turn of the night, the one that changed what kind of story this even was. "You're the paramedic," he said. He'd peeled off one glove and was rubbing his face with a shaking hand. "You've been out there. You've seen the bites up close. How fast is the turn? Be precise." "Minutes," I said. 3, 4, sometimes less than that. Bite to dead to walking again. He went very still. Then he nodded slowly, and the color drained out of his face in a way I recognized clinically. The vasoconstriction of real fear. "That's not a virus," he said. "I want you to understand what I'm telling you. Nothing biological turns a host that fast. A virus has to get into your cells, hijack the machinery, replicate, spread, cross the blood-brain barrier that's hours at the theoretical floor, and realistically days. Rabies, the fastest neurotropic thing we know of, takes weeks. Minutes is impossible for an infection that starts at the bite." He looked at me, and his eyes were doing math I didn't like. "Minutes means it isn't traveling from the bite at all. Minutes means it's already everywhere in the body before the teeth ever break the skin. The bite isn't the infection, Walt. The bite is just the trigger. It wakes up something that's already there." I didn't follow. He saw that I didn't, and he leaned forward, urgent. "It means everyone out there," he said. "Every single person on that mall. They were already carrying it. Before the parade. Before today. The bite doesn't transmit anything. The bite, or whatever the trigger really is, just wakes the thing up in a person who already has it sleeping inside them." He looked past me, out the open back doors of the rig at the rest of them, scattered across the loading bay in the orange light. Doreen and Hector and Sam huddled by the wall. Carla, Priya, Eugene leaning in the bay doorway. "Which means," he said quietly, "the only question that actually matters anymore is which of us is already carrying it. And what exactly wakes it up?" The loading bay went absolutely silent. Even the bodies on the far side of the roll-up door seemed, for one long moment, to go still, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Owusu's words settled over all of us like a physical weight, and I watched every person in that bay do the same private arithmetic I was doing. The sideways glance at the person nearest them, the small, unconscious shift of weight away. If the bite was only a trigger, and the thing was already inside people before the parade, then the question was no longer, how do we keep from getting bitten? The question was, what wakes it up? And am I already carrying it? And is the man standing next to me? I'm a paramedic. I don't deal in panic. I deal in mechanisms, in causes and effects you can act on. So I pushed past the fear and started asking Owusu the questions that could actually change a decision. What spreads it, if not the bite? What's the trigger? He didn't know. Nobody knew. But he had a theory, and the theory frightened me more than anything I'd seen with my own eyes. And it came down to timing. "Think about how it happened," he said, talking faster now, the scientist in him taking over from the terrified man. 300,000 people on the mall, and you said the turn rolled through them in a wave, west to east, over the span of a few minutes. That is not how contagion behaves. Contagion is messy, it's patchy. It jumps from contact to contact. It does not move in a clean front across open ground. He pointed, without quite meaning to, out toward the mall, toward the west, toward the Lincoln Memorial, toward the dark river where the fireworks barge sat armed and waiting. That's a broadcast, a signal. Something hit all of them at very nearly the same time, and it reached the west end of the mall first. And the wave moved east at what? You said it took a few minutes to cross from the Lincoln Memorial to the Capitol? That's almost exactly the speed sound travels across open ground. A signal. A trigger that propagated like sound. I thought about my air horn, and the way every gray-eyed head on Constitution Avenue had snapped toward it in perfect unison. And a cold and terrible thought took shape that I did not want to look at directly. They tracked sound. What if the very thing that woke them was also the thing they now hunted? What if sound wasn't just how you drew them? What if some specific sound, some particular frequency, was how a sleeping person became one of them in the first place? It was only a theory. We had no way to test it and no time to try. But it reorganized the entire night in my head. Because if Owusu was right, then the museum's 72 hours of generator power and its steel doors weren't holding off an external threat that the cavalry would eventually mop up. They were holding off each other, and whatever signal might come again, and a clock none of us could see the face of. The safest building in the city was only safe until the next time the air filled with the wrong sound. So I did what I always do when the big picture is too dark to look at. I narrowed down to what I could control right now with my own hands. There were still people upstairs. The hidden family near the mall entrance, 4 of them, 2 of them children, in the worst location in the building, and the man at the Hope Diamond, who hadn't reappeared on a single monitor since he'd walked toward the north stairwell. The family was the priority, no question. I got Eugene back on the monitors, and we found them, and they were still wedged into the coat check alcove. The parents were pressed against the back wall, the father's body curled protectively over all of them. The older child, a boy, maybe 10, had his hand clamped over the mouth of the younger one. A little girl who couldn't have been more than 5, and who was clearly at the edge of breaking. Smart parents, smart kid. And 40 feet away, through the great glass curtain wall of the mall entrance, the dead were stacked 3 and 4 deep against the glass, a solid wall of milk-eyed faces and pawing hands. And the glass, I could see it even on the grainy monitor, was already laced with spiderweb cracks, a fracture pattern spreading slowly outward under the weight. We had minutes, maybe less, and the route from the coat check to the freight elevator ran straight through the rotunda, under the African elephant, across 30 yards of open, polished floor with no cover at all, with 2 small children who could not be relied on to stay silent if a dead thing came lurching out of the dark. Here's where Priya proved me wrong about her worth, completely and for good. She'd been crouched in the doorway of the office, listening to all of it: the cleaner's rescue, Owusu's theory, the geometry of the building, the impossible problem of the family. And she stood up and said, quietly but with a steadiness that surprised me, "The HVAC, the climate system, it runs through the entire building, every floor, and the ducts in the public halls are huge. They have to be, to move that volume of air through spaces that size. I've been up in them." She held up her bandaged arm, almost absently. "Last year we had a water intrusion in the entomology storage, condensation off a duct, and I was the only one small enough to get up onto the catwalk and into the run with the maintenance guys to find it. I know the layout up there." She looked straight at me. "I can reach the family through the ducts. The dead can't follow into a duct they can't climb. They can't even figure out a doorknob. And it's quiet up there. There's no floor for them to hear my footsteps on. I can get to the grill above the coat check and guide the family out on a route the dead can't track." It was a good plan, and it was a terrible plan, both at the exact same time. And I hated it. And it was the best thing anyone had said all night. The ducts ran above the public halls and were accessible from a maintenance catwalk off the 3rd floor. Priya could move through them unseen and unheard, reach the run above or beside the coat check, and talk the family out along a path the dead had no way to follow. I should have gone instead. I want that on the record, plainly. I'm bigger and slower, and I'd never have fit through half the runs she could thread. But I should have found a way, because what happened next is on me for letting her go. I waited for all of 4 seconds, her size against mine. her knowledge of the ducks against my total ignorance of them. The screaming clock on that cracking glass, and I let her go. It was the correct operational decision. I have never once been able to make peace with it. Priya took the freight elevator up to the 3rd floor with the spare radio clipped to her collar and her flashlight gripped in her teeth, and we tracked her by voice. She narrated the whole way, low and continuous. And I understood after a minute that she was doing it partly to keep herself from coming apart, and partly to keep us calm down below. And it was one of the bravest things I've ever heard a human being do. Okay. I'm at the catwalk. The access panel's here. It's stiff. It hasn't been opened since the leak. There. I'm pulling it. It's tight. It's tighter than I remember. But I'm okay. I'm in the run. A pause, and her voice dropped lower, strained. God, it's loud up here. The air handler's right above this section. I can feel it in my chest. I can barely hear myself think over it. Loud. The air handler. The climate system Eugene had told me about down in the bay, the one running off the generator, moving thousands of cubic feet of air to keep the specimens from rotting. It was loud inside the ducts. A constant, massive, low industrial drone. And that was the moment the thing I'd been refusing to look at all night walked right up and looked back at me. Sound was the trigger. That was Owusu's theory. A frequency, a vibration. Something that traveled like sound and woke up what was already sleeping. And Priya Anand was crawling right now through a steel duct directly beneath an industrial air handler that produced a constant, enormous low-frequency drone. I had no proof the air handler's frequency was the trigger. I had no way on earth to know. But I could not take the chance, and I could not get her out fast, and the geometry of it ran up my spine like cold water. I keyed the radio, fighting every muscle in my throat to keep my voice level and clinical. Priya, I need you to check in with me. How are you feeling right now? Be honest with me, exactly how you feel. A pause. The drone behind her voice. Scared, tired, my arms are shaking. Why? Walt, why are you asking me that? Any headache? Anything strange in your vision? Any flickering? Any spots? Any taste in your mouth? Anything metallic? Like pennies? Like blood? A longer pause. The kind of pause that is itself the answer. The kind I've heard 100 times from patients, right before they tell you the thing they're terrified to say out loud. My head hurts, she said. And her voice had changed only a little, only by a degree. But I'd spent 30 years listening for exactly that kind of change. It started a minute ago. It came on fast. Walt, my head really hurts and... A swallow, audible over the drone. And the air down here tastes like pennies. Why does it taste like that? Walt, why does it... Eugene grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt. On the monitor, the family in the coat check had heard something moving in the duct above them, and were craning up toward the ceiling with desperate, dawning hope on their faces. The father lifting a hand toward the grill. And in the duct, somewhere in the dark, above the 3rd floor, Priya Anand had gone silent. And then I heard, very clearly, transmitted right into the office, the sound of her flashlight slipping from between her teeth and clattering against the steel. Priya, I said. Priya, answer me. Talk to me right now. Nothing. And then a sound came through that handset that I will hear in the worst hours of every night for the rest of my life. It was not a scream. It was a slow, wet, deliberate, mechanical sound. The sound of a person learning to breathe a new way. The sound of something that had been Priya figuring out the shape of its own throat. This was the critical decision. and I'm going to walk you through it as honestly as I can, because I've replayed it 10,000 times since, and I still cannot tell you for certain that I chose right. Priya was gone, or turning, which was the same thing with minutes left on it. She was up in the ducts above the 3rd floor with a live radio still clipped to her collar and broadcasting those sounds into the office. And God help us through the open channel toward the family below, who had no idea that the hope they were reaching toward in the ceiling had just become the thing in the building most likely to kill them. And the dead tracked sound. And if Owusu's theory was right, if the air handler's drone was the trigger, then any one of us who climbed up into those ducts to retrieve her or to finish her route to the family would be crawling straight into the exact conditions that had just turned her. The rescue route had become a trap baited with itself. I had 4 choices and a few seconds to pick among them, and I knew even then that I would carry whichever one I chose for as long as I lived. I could send no one, abandon the family, let the glass fail, and let them run or die, and protect the 8 living souls already down in the loading bay. That was the cold math. That was the protocol answer, the scene safety answer, the answer that keeps a paramedic alive long enough to help the next patient. You do not trade a known life for a maybe. I could go up myself, into the ducts, into the drone, and try to reach the family the way Priya had been about to, knowing full well I might turn somewhere in the dark before I ever got to them, and become one more horror loose in the walls of the building. I could try to use the building itself, the freight elevator, the camera grid, Eugene's map of the floors all held in his head, to extract the family by ground, through the rotunda, fast and loud, and accept that fast and loud meant pulling every dead thing in the museum down on top of 2 children. Or I could do the thing that had been quietly assembling itself in the back of my mind ever since Owusu first said the word frequency. If sound was the trigger, then sound was also a tool. The dead tracked it absolutely. I'd watched 100 heads turn toward a single point of noise. So what if I gave them a louder point? What if I gave the entire building one single overwhelming sound, way off at one far end, and pulled every dead thing in the place toward it like water down a drain? And in doing so, opened up a silent corridor at the opposite end, so the family could walk out from under the elephant, while every milk-eyed monster in the museum was crowded against a wall 100 yards away, clawing at a noise? The ambulance siren. I had a 5-ton ambulance with a siren built to be heard over highway traffic for the better part of a mile, parked right there in the loading bay at the south end of the building. And the building had a public address system. Eugene confirmed it fast. Used it himself every night for the closing announcements, with speakers wired into every hall and stairwell, all of it controllable right there from the security office. Here was the plan, and here was its cost. I would drive the ambulance out of the loading bay, back up onto Constitution Avenue, siren full and screaming, and laid the exterior dead away from the building from the outside, drawing the herd that was massed against those mall-side glass walls. At the same instant, Eugene would put a steady tone over the museum's PA at the far north end of the building, drawing the interior dead north toward the stairwell, away from the rotunda, caught between 2 sounds pulling in 2 directions. The rotunda and the path from the coat check to the freight elevator would become, for a few minutes, the quietest stretch of floor in the museum. And Owusu and Carla, who both volunteered before I'd even finished laying it out. Carla just nodding, Owusu already stripping off his remaining glove, like a man rolling up his sleeves, would move the family out by ground, while the dead chased noise in 2 opposite directions. The cost was me. Once I drove that ambulance out the loading dock with the dead following the siren, I was not coming back. There was no version of it where I led the herd off, parked, killed the siren, and strolled home. The siren had to keep wailing and the rig had to keep moving, or the dead would lose the sound and turn around and come right back to the building. The dock door would have to come down behind me and stay down, so I'd be outside, alone, in a city full of the dead, in a vehicle that had just become an enormous beacon broadcasting my exact location to every walking corpse for half a mile. I'd already traded scene safety once tonight. For a family of 3, I bought 15 seconds with an air horn and never saw again. Then I'd traded it for 8 strangers in a basement. And now the man who'd made himself a rule. I am not a hero, I'm a paramedic. Keep them breathing, do the job. Was about to trade his own survival for 4 more people he had never even met. I knew it for exactly what it was. I did it anyway. I'm still not sure it was wrong. And I'm honestly not sure it was right. What about you? Would you have driven out into the dark? Or would you have kept the doors shut and held on to your 8? I've never been able to settle it, and I'd rather hear how you'd have called it than keep arguing with myself. I told Eugene to wait for my signal on the radio, and not a second before. I told Owusu the ground route twice, made him repeat it back coat check, left at the rotunda, under the elephant, the unmarked door by the gift shop, the service corridor, the freight elevator. Eugene calls it down. I told Doreen and Hector to keep the family calm over the radio and to be ready to receive them in the bay. And then I climbed up into the cab of Medic 41 and I started the diesel. And for one moment, I just sat there in the cool dark of the loading bay with my hands on the wheel, listening. The booming on the dock door behind me, the faint static of the radios. And under it all, still going impossibly, that automated station, the last bars of a Sousa march that had been looping since before the world ended, brass and cymbals playing a parade for nobody. Then I keyed the handset one last time. Eugene, raise the door. On my 3. 1, 2. The consequence came faster and worse than the plan. On 3, the roll-up door rattled up its track, and Constitution Avenue poured into the bay. And Constitution Avenue was a nightmare, painted in sodium orange. The streetlights had somehow stayed on. And under them the dead stood in their hundreds now, far more than before, drawn by the noise of the city's death, drifting in loose herds across the asphalt and the abandoned cars. I hit the siren and the light bar both, and I drove straight up the ramp and into them, and the sound did exactly what I'd prayed it would. Heads snapped toward me from every direction at once, a whole street of them turning as one. And the wall of bodies that had been stacked against the museum's glass on the mall side, I couldn't see them from where I was. But Eugene narrated it over the radio in a voice thin with disbelief. That wall peeled away from the cracking glass and began to flow toward the sound of me, the siren dragging the herd off the building like a magnet dragging filings off a plate. And inside, Eugene put a steady electronic tone over the PA system at the north end. And on the monitors, he watched the interior dead turn and drift north toward it, away from the rotunda. And he watched Owusu and Carla come out of the dark and move the family, the father carrying the little girl, the mother gripping the boy's hand, Owusu and Carla flanking them out of the coat check. Across the open rotunda floor under the great African elephant, fast and low and silent. He watched them reach the unmarked door, then the service corridor, then the freight elevator. He watched the steel doors slide shut on all 6 of them. And then he watched the box descend through the building toward the bay, toward the 8 who were already safe. And he said into the radio, his voice cracking, "They're in, Walt. They're in the elevator. They made it. You did it. They made it." It worked. The family lived. I need you to hold on to that, because of everything that happened in that building that night. That part worked exactly the way I drew it up. 4 people who would have died screaming when that glass finally failed are alive in the world today because of a siren and a tone, and 2 researchers who volunteered without being asked, and a route across an empty rotunda floor. Hold on to that. I do. But the plan had a flaw I had not seen, and the flaw was the 11th person, the man at the Hope Diamond, the one who'd held up the sign and told us to blind ourselves. While we'd been running rescues and theorizing about frequencies, he had not been hiding, and he had not been frightened. Eugene saw it on the monitors after the family was down, and his voice came over my handset thin and sick as I led my screaming parade of the dead East along Constitution. The man had been in the north stairwell the entire time, and when Eugene put the tone over the PA at the north end to pull the interior dead away from the family's route, he had pulled them straight toward the man, dozens of them, converging on the north hall. Except the man wasn't running. He was standing in the middle of the north hall, in the middle of the drifting, gathering dead, completely calm, completely upright, completely unbitten. And they weren't touching him. They moved around him the way river water moves around a stone, in the current flowing past, close enough to brush him, and simply not registering him as prey. "Walt," Eugene said, and his voice had gone high and strange. "Walt, they're not attacking him. They're right on top of him, and they're just going around. Why aren't they touching him? Why isn't he?" And then the man looked up into the camera again, the same way he had hours before. But this time, he wasn't holding a sign. This time, he had something small and black in his right hand. And he raised it, and he pressed it with his thumb. And over my handset, 2 blocks away, I heard Eugene make a sound I'd never heard a grown man make. And then the museum's PA tone changed. It dropped. It fell down out of the range I'd asked for and into something else, a low, vast, awful organ pipe drone that I felt 2 blocks away in my back teeth and in the fillings of my jaw and in the bones of my hands on the steering wheel. And it wasn't coming from the North Hall anymore. It was coming from everywhere. From every single speaker in the building at once. The trigger. He had the trigger. He'd had it the entire time. The man at the Hope Diamond had never been a survivor we'd failed to rescue. He had been a man waiting, patiently, against the most famous gemstone in the world, watching us. Watching how the museum systems worked. Watching us run our rescues and route our people and call our freight elevator, and I understood it all at once. Far too late, watching us teach him the layout of the PA grid through our own actions. The sign telling us to turn off the cameras had never been about the dead seeing status lights. It had nothing to do with the dead. He'd wanted us blind. He'd wanted us to stop watching him while he found the one system that mattered. Over the handset, in the last second before the channel filled completely with that drone, I heard Eugene Tarr say one word. He said, "Owusu," just the name, just the start of a warning. And then the radio drowned in that low organ pipe sound. And then under the drone I heard the wet mechanical breathing I'd heard from Priya, except now it was many. Layered over each other, rising in the office and the bay and everywhere. And then there was nothing at all. I want to be careful here, because the honest truth is, I do not know everything that happened inside that building after the drone went over the PA. I'm not going to invent it for you. I know what I knew. I know the loading bay held 8 people plus the family that had just arrived, 12 souls in all. I know the freight elevator was the only fast way between the floors and that the office and the bay were both wired into that PA. I know the drone came out of every speaker in the building at the same instant, in a place where, If Awusu was right, everyone was already carrying the thing that was sleeping. And I know what the drone did to Priya in a duct above the 3rd floor with one air handler humming over her. The radio went dead, and it stayed dead. And I was alone on Constitution Avenue with a screaming siren and a half-tank of diesel and a city full of the dead. And the building I'd run to for safety, the building I had spent the whole night trying to keep other people out of the worst of, had become the trap. I have never found out who the man at the Hope Diamond was. I have thought about him every single day since, whether he was the cause of all of it, the architect, or just one more person who'd figured out the frequency before the rest of us, and made a different choice with the knowledge, decided to use it instead of run from it. Whether the little black device in his hand was something he had built or something he had been handed. Whether he was alone or whether there were others like him. Calm men standing patiently beside the public address systems of train stations and stadiums and arenas in other cities, waiting for their moment, immune to the very thing they were about to set loose. I don't know. I'll never know. The not knowing is its own kind of weight. And I've learned to carry it the way you learn to carry a bad knee. You just stop expecting it not to hurt. I drove until the diesel ran low. I led the dead east through the federal core and then turned them north off the wide ceremonial avenues and into the tighter residential streets where the noise of me thinned the herds out across miles of asphalt, dropping one here and two there as the sound got distant and they lost the thread of it. Somewhere in the dark of an outer neighborhood, on a quiet street of row houses with darkened windows, I killed the siren and the lights, let the rig coast the last block on momentum and silence, and let it roll to a gentle stop against a curb. And then I sat there in the cab and did the only thing there was left to do, which was nothing. I went silent, the way I'd told Doreen to go silent in her closet hours before. No radio, no engine, no light. Just a man in an ambulance, finally learning the lesson the whole night had been trying to teach him. The dead track sound. The living make noise to save each other. And somewhere in the gap between those two facts lives every single choice I made that night. The ones that saved 12 people from a basement and a cracking wall of glass, and the one that may have killed all 12 of them in the end, with a drone out of a stranger's hand. I'm still out here. The rig is long dead, the battery, then the rot of a vehicle that doesn't move. But I kept the radio for a long time, the handset off the dash, hoping against everything for a single click. One click, no words, the way I'd taught Doreen to do it in the dark of that supply closet. I never got one. The frequency that ended the world traveled like sound. And the only way I've found to stay alive in the country it left behind is to be the quietest thing in any room I'm in, which is a hard, strange way to live for a man who spent 30 years of his life rushing toward the noise, toward the screaming, toward the worst sound on any given street. Because the worst sound was always where the work was. If you ever hear a low drone come over a public address system, the kind you don't so much hear as feel, down in your jaw and your back teeth, in a train station or a stadium or a shopping mall, don't wait around to understand it. Don't be the one who trusts the calm stranger with a confident plan over the things your own eyes have already shown you. Go silent, go low. Get to the quietest place you can find and put something solid at your back and stay there until the math changes. That's the only real advice I have left to give anybody. That and a question I'm never going to be able to answer. 8 people in a basement, alive because I held a door shut. 4 more alive because I drove out into the dark and turned myself into the loudest thing in the capital of the United States. And maybe all 12 of them gone in a single second. Because the man at the Hope Diamond was patient and I was not. Because I taught him the building while I was busy being a hero. I made the calls a paramedic makes. Keep them breathing. Do the job. Don't be a hero. That last one was always the most important rule, the one that keeps you and your patients alive. And I broke it the moment I leaned on that air horn for a family I never saw again. And I'd break it again. God help me, I think I would break it every single time. The fireworks never went off. I think about that more than almost anything else. The barge sat armed on the Potomac all that night and all the nights after. And somewhere on it, a computer was probably still patiently counting down to a show no one would ever watch. Waiting for a launch command from people who were no longer people. A sky that was supposed to be filled with light. And the dark that came up underneath it instead, rolling west to east across 300,000 souls while a marching band kept playing. And the crowd kept clapping. None of them knowing that the loudest, brightest night of the whole year had already become the quietest one in the country's history. And that the only ones who would live to see the morning were the ones who learned, fast and hard, to make no sound at all. I'm Walt Reyes. I was a paramedic. On the 4th of July, the outbreak hit the parade route before the fireworks ever started. And I am one of the reasons that 12 strangers had a chance at the morning. And I may be one of the reasons they didn't get it. I still don't know which. I've made my peace with most things in this new world. I've never been able to make it with that. And every time I find a quiet place in the dark, with my back against something solid and my breath held tight and shallow in my chest, listening to a city that doesn't make human sounds anymore, I still find myself listening for one thing. A single click on a radio that hasn't worked in a very long time. It never comes. But I keep listening for it. It's the only part of the job I have left.